Okay, let's get underway. My name is Jerry Davison. I'm Dean of the Davis School of Gerontology and Director of the Andrews Gerontology Center. And I want to welcome you all, especially the parents, for this Parents' Weekend, and to compliment you on your good judgment and good taste and good budgeting to be able to have your children come to this university. It's an amazing place, and one of the nice things and one of the unique things about USC is this building that you're in, and the existence of a school within the university devoted to a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary study and research and study and education in gerontology, the study of how people develop over the lifespan, how they change over the lifespan in all sorts of ways, the many forces impinging on them, and as to how they develop and how this moves into what we call the senior years or the elder years, whose definition I think continues to get somewhat refined. I think as those of us who are in the field get older ourselves, we decide to up the age when you're older. So old age now is defined as age 90. So. We're extremely pleased and honored to have Dr. Gene Cohen as as a guest speaker today. Dr. Cohen is one of those double degree folks to both an MD, with a residency in psychiatry, and a PhD in gerontology. And he's the first director of the Center on Aging, Health, and Humanities, which was established in 1994 at George Washington University, where he also holds the positions of Professor of Healthcare Sciences and Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He's one of these folks who take all of his time in telling you about his achievements, so just a couple of notes. During 91 to 93, he served as acting director of the National Institute on Aging, which is part of the National Institutes of Health and is the primary federal agency for the funding of education and training in our field. During his tenure with the government, he received the Public Health Service Distinguished Service Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed by the Public Health Service. He has briefed Congress regularly on aging programs and issues, and was instrumental in helping to increase funding for Alzheimer's disease and related conditions. Dr. Cohen has additionally been very active in the dissemination of good knowledge about aging on national television and other major media. We were just chatting in my office just now about the role and the sometimes complicated role between people in the academic and research realms and folks in the media. And one of the things that senior people especially get to do or are asked to do, and sort of part of our job is to try to represent solid and provide solid information about issues that affect society, and certainly issues related to aging fall into that category. So among other programs, he's been on Nightline, where he's interviewed by Barbara Walters, been on McNeil Lehrer, CBS Nightly News, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, and he participated in a series of public service messages with George Burns. Which of all his many achievements, this is the one that I envy him the most from, to have been able to spend time with this remarkable person. Dr. Cohen, and this gets to the topic of his talk today, has major interests in creativity in aging and in intergenerational programs that involve older adults and children. He has developed 3 new intergenerational board games that have received recognition in national and international art shows and has received attention on national TV. And these games are the subject of 3 featured lectures that he was asked to give by the Smithsonian Institution. And a PBS film has been developed on his book, The Creative Age. So it's a real treat for me to introduce Dr. Gene Cohen to you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? They're adjusting the sound for my mic. If there's any trouble hearing me, please wave your hand. I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is I couldn't find my notes. You're wondering if that's the good news, what's the bad news? I remember every word. There's no denying the problems that are associated with aging but what has been denied is the potential. And this is an area of research that's absolutely exploding. So today is the rest of the story about aging. And in many of these sectors that I'm going to be talking about, there's been significant contribution from work from scientists here at the Andrews Center. So it's a wonderful research and academic community. We're going to talk about positive changes that occur, not despite aging, but because of aging. For so long, if an older person did something, never mind remarkable, but just okay, people would say, wow, they did that despite their age. A little patronizing editorialization there. But what science, and particularly as we move in the late 20th century into the 21st century, is increasingly showing are positive changes, not despite aging, but because of aging. In many ways, the question about what aging is has changed dramatically. And over the past 35 years, the image has changed in three major ways. In the late 1960s and early 70s in our society, images of aging were probably at their low point. That's when you heard phrases such as, you can't trust anybody over 30, phrases like intergenerational warfare, age gap. But from my research, what was really going on there was not an age gap, but an education gap. Typical level of education of a person 65 years of age in 1970 was 8.6 years, less than a high school education. That same typical person, age 65 in 1990, was 12.1 years, greater than a high school education. And in the year 2000, when my book, The Creative Age, came out, percentage-wise, the fastest-growing group of college graduates, percentage-wise, were those over 50, and the fastest-growing group of graduate students, percentage-wise, were those over 50. So education levels have changed extraordinarily, just from 1970 to 1990, and during that period, the sociological literature, and again, a lot of that was done here, showed increasing positive intergenerational changes between the old and the young. Well, the first of two major sea changes in aging occurred in the early to mid-70s. At that time, scientists began to look at a different way at aging. Prior to that, the late 60s, early 70s view was negative changes were your destiny with aging. They were inevitable and they were unalterable. Then in the early to mid-70s, what began to occur in science was the identification of a number of these changes as not representing aging per se, but potentially modifiable problems. And for the scientists to suddenly look at a negative change as potentially modifiable creates a whole new sense of opportunity and challenge to do something about it. And this was the beginning of a major momentum change in research about aging. And for the policymaker to suddenly look at something no longer as inevitable and unalterable, potentially modifiable, created a whole new sense of social responsibility. And this translated in 1975 in the creation of the modern federal research structure on aging. 1975, the National Institute on Aging appointed its first director. That same year, in 1975, I had the good fortune of being appointed the first head of the first Center on Aging at the National Institute of Mental Health. And the VA established its Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Centers program. All of that was in 1975. And this new problem focus launched the field of geriatrics, which began to soar in the 1980s and since then. Well, the leap from looking at inevitable, unalterable change to potentially modifiable problems, which represented the first major sea change in the mid-70s, was such a huge leap. It was too big a leap to take the next step to look beyond problems to potential. But this is what was happening by the end of the 1990s. And in the year 2000, I published the book, The Creative Age. It was the first book totally focused on creativity, and it was written in part to document the second major sea change in aging, attention to potential beyond problems, not in place of problems, but in addition to problems, to the extent that I think will emerge here that today one is no longer state-of-the-art in aging unless they're addressing both the problems and the potential. Are you okay?
Just got a little buzz.
What happens when I need my sound? Okay. All right. Problem solving. It's part of the creative process of any lecture. So mirror, mirror on the wall, what is aging after all, has a more positive view than has ever been the case. And just as a reminder of what's possible, and this was alluded to in the very kind introduction I received, was the wonderful opportunity that I had in 1991 when I was at the National Institute on Aging to interview the 97-year-old, that's George Burns, the one on your left, on the eve of his birthday. I'm having a little trouble here with my laser pointer, so my daughter gave me an alternative. Especially good to point at cigars. So Burns and I got together to do a series of public service messages on aging, and it was really one of the best illustrations of the changing face of aging in contemporary times. Burns, as I mentioned, was 97. His agent, who was very understandably very protective of his time in setting up the meeting, we didn't realize until we got there, was himself 85, and the joke writer was in his 70s. Now, unknown to me, Burns staged this elaborate joke at my expense. And to appreciate the joke, you have to understand the context of the meeting. It was during the height of the Surgeon General's campaign against smoking, and I was there as a public health official. So as we sat down, and I handed him the certificate that he's holding, acknowledging his positive contributions to images on aging, on his cue, in came the then Entertainment Tonight cameras, at which point he hands me this long, illegal Cuban cigar. But coming from Washington, I graciously accepted it and said, not to worry, I don't inhale. And he said that he didn't inhale either, and the more he thought about it, he was going to run for president. Then he began talking about how he was adapting to his own advanced age. He said, for example, he had begun to ask for his applause in advance, just in case, and that he no longer ordered green bananas. Then he gave this, he also, I wanted to involve him as my statistician. He gave this wonderful illustration of his creative use of statistics. He said, it's good to reach 100 because very few people die after 100. I don't know how it would go over in the journals, but... And then he gave this wonderful illustration of the creative use of humor to try something new that was difficult. He said he'd begun to develop low back pain that was interfering with his routines, and he discussed this with his colleagues who said, why don't you sit down when you do your routines? He said, how can I sit down? All my life I've been a stand-up comic. But then he tried it, and he found it had no adverse impact at all. And then he leaned over, grabbed my shoulder, whispered in my ear, and he said, you know, Dr. Cohen, if necessary, I'm going to become a lie-down comic. So he was prepared for whatever life would deal him. Now, again, the purpose of our meetings was to do these public service messages, and the goal of the messages was to catch the public's attention to write into the National Institute on Aging for information about aging. And you only have 15, 20 seconds for these messages. The one that was most successful was when I leaned over and asked him, what does your doctor say about your smoking and your drinking? And Burns, without missing a beat, replied, my doctor, he's dead. So we were totally inundated for the next 2 years with requests for information about aging. Now, our whole understanding of potential with aging goes far beyond individual anecdotes. There's just an exploding neuroscience to help us understand what's possible. And a lot of these experiments began in the 1960s and 1970s that really set the stage for our new understanding of brain plasticity, and these were in many ways the foundations, the neuroscientific foundations for the brain fitness movement that we're witnessing today. My book that followed The Creative Age was The Mature Mind, that not by coincidence came out the month the oldest of the boomers turned 60, and I waited to write it until I turned 60. And one of the things that I pointed out in The Mature Mind was that in retrospect, the 20th century had been the century of physical health. We had witnessed a greater than 50% increase in life expectancy in the 20th century, from under 50 years in America in the year 1900 to over 75 in the year 2000. And I predicted in the 21st century that older adults and boomers in particular would start to be asking, will my mind keep up with my body? And no sooner written this explosion with Sudoku, Nintendo's efforts, Pause at Science, and then brain fitness, staying sharp programs everywhere. And this is really one of the things that especially distinguishes the present cohort in aging, and especially the boomers, is essentially an equal interest in brain fitness and staying sharp as well as physical fitness. But this is one of about now 100 scientific slides I'm going to show. No, just kidding, just kidding. Most of them are pictures. But this is a schematic diagram of two neurons, brain cells, under magnification. There's one here, and the beginning of a second one here. In the human brain, in the thinking part of the brain alone, we have over 100 billion of these nerve cells, these neurons, B as in big. And they communicate with one another at contact points, these synapses, that where the communication between the cells occurs, and they're facilitated by these projections of the cells coming together. Now, a given cell has the capacity to have contact with over 100, in some cases hundreds, of other cells. And Eric Kandel, for example, who got the Nobel Prize in memory, talked about as many as a quadrillion possible contact points between neurons. That number is so huge, we might as well just speak in kid language of a gazillion. There's so many contact points, but they begin to help us understand the extraordinary complexity and capacity of the human brain. But up until the latter part of the 20th century, the people saw the brain as a whole as a static organ, largely formed at birth, certainly in terms of the number of brain cells. One of the longest-standing myths or misinformation about aging is that we had all of our brain cells by the age of 3, and this influenced national policy. Tremendous pressure was placed on families and especially mothers to say, look, you have all your brain cells by 3, and then you begin to lose them, and it's just a matter of time before that accumulative loss catches up and starts to affect the course of aging and how well your child will do. So you have those 3 years, and you better do everything possible to make the most of it. It was just an extraordinary impact. Some good things that happened, like the Head Start program, but it was really this part of this view that aging only promised loss and decline and negativity. And it wasn't until the end of the 20th century, and I'll come back to this, that this view was corrected with the discovery that we do produce new neurons. But prior to that, there was very little sense that the brain could respond in any modifiable way to challenge. There are more seats down here. There's, I think, at least a half a dozen. So if people want to have those. And so basically what happened in a series of experiments, and they were done in California. Marion Diamond played a major part in this research. The goal was to see what would happen when laboratory animals, laboratory rats, were exposed to mental challenge. And so, in a general sense, the way the study was set up is there were 2 groups of rats. Typical group of laboratory rats in the usual environment that they occupied, typical maze that they might be placed in to have some stimulation. Then there was the experimental group. This was the group that was challenged in more ways. They were placed in a much more complicated maze to negotiate, heightened mental stimulation challenge. They were given incentives to negotiate this maze. Many of their favorite foods were placed at the end of the maze to send out aromas to titillate their nostrils to reach the end of the maze. Foods like Reese's Pieces, Fruit Loops, M&Ms, the usual trash that rats like to nibble on. And rats, like people, enjoy a more social environment, and so there were more rats that were placed in the cage. And rats, like people, enjoy having a good time, so they were the equivalent of toys that were placed in the cage. Time went by, and the brains of the two groups of rats were compared. And what was found startled the scientists, startled them in a positive way. What they discovered was that the challenged rats had a significant increase in the sprouting of new dendrites. These are like branches from a tree. And they participated in the formation of new synapses, these key contact points for communication. And that challenge and stimulation also resulted in enhanced production of these little cells called glial cells. These are cells that have as a primary role that of nourishing neurons, the brain cells, to keep them healthy. In the study of Einstein's brain on autopsy, he was found to have an elevated level of glial cells compared to the average individual. The challenged animals had an increased production of glial cells. And not shown in the diagram was the key neurotransmitter found to be at deficit levels in Alzheimer's disease. It's called acetylcholine. Many of the medications in the market today designed to improve memory function in Alzheimer's disease have as their mechanism of action the ability to elevate the level of acetylcholine. There are also some stairs here that if people want to sit on, and if somebody wants to sit right here, it's fine. So what was found in these experiments is that the enzyme that produces acetylcholine, this key transmitter involved in intellectual functioning, that the enzyme was elevated, producing higher levels of acetylcholine. So this was remarkable. These challenged animals, there was no physical stimulation, no pharmacologic stimulation, no electrical stimulation, just mental challenge and environmental stimulation, had increased synapse formation, dendritic sprouting, glial cell formation, and an elevated level of acetylcholine. So basically, modern neuroscience succeeded in validating folk advice. Use it or lose it. Hooray for modern neuroscience. but modern neuroscience then took this a step further. They repeated these experiments with the oldest of the animals, and they found, regardless of age, right to the end, in response to mental challenge and environmental stimulation, the oldest of the animals showed all of the same changes. Increased synapse formation, increased formation of dendrites, elevated formation of glial cells and acetylcholine. So modern neuroscience took folk advice a step further and showed that it was never too late to use it to alter losing it. So this was really ultimately part of the foundation for what now has become this sweeping new focus on brain fitness. Now I have here in the diagram at the top this dance between nature and nurture. You know, we're in a time in science where there's a fascination with the human genome, the power of genes. Now in that regard, I have to diverge for a moment and thank my parents for naming me Gene. You know, I feel so au courant. I wouldn't have needed any other titles, you know, or degrees with that name. I felt so well positioned in where science was going. But what people don't realize about genes, among the many fascinating ones, the ones that are on chromosomes, not the ones at a lecture podium, is that many of these are in latent stages, that they're not doing what they're designed to do unless something turns them on. Sort of like a light bulb has the capacity to throw tremendous light, but nothing happens unless somebody flips the switch. And with many of these genes in the brain, nothing happens until something flips their switch. And what flips the switch, in many cases, is mental challenge and environmental stimulation. Then the genes do their work. They start mobilizing their mechanisms to lead to the production of protein synthesis and the formation of dendrites and increasing the ability to have more synapses formed. So this is truly an egalitarian dance between nature and nurture. Now finally, at the end of the 20th century, one of the biggest myths on aging was finally turned over upside down, and that was that we don't produce new neurons. And to me, this is really one of the best illustrations of even the best and the brightest having a hard time stepping outside the box. Many of the leading neuroscientists, including Nobel laureates in the 20th century, said neurogenesis was impossible. It's impossible, new brain cell formation. And their gold standard argument was neurons are not like liver cells, and they're not like skin cells. You can lose over 2/3 of your liver and regenerate new cells. Every time you have a wound on your skin, those cells regenerate. They said neurons cannot regenerate. And so they really linked neurogenesis to neuronal regeneration. But outside the box, in a different part, in a part of the brain where this was first discovered, called in the hippocampus, and a part of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus, this part of the brain is where information is initially received, and where we begin to lay down that information for memory formation. And what was discovered that within the hippocampus, this information processing part of the brain, was an area, nucleus of cells called the dentate gyrus, that was filled with stem cells. And what was discovered is that many of these stem cells formed new neurons, de novo formation of neurons. So it was outside the box. It wasn't neuroregeneration. It was brand new formation of neurons. Now, a number of the naysayers in science had some difficulty adjusting to this. And they said, okay, there's neurogenesis, but I bet if you do the studies, what you find is that neurogenesis is greater in older adults than younger adults. You know, as if that trivializes whatever neurogenesis going elsewhere. They did the experiments and they felt really good. This is what the experiments showed. But this is what's called, I have to say this coming from Boston very carefully with the articulation, it's called a half-asked question. Because they only did half the experiment. Somebody did an inspired second part of the experiment and looked what happened when you added challenge. And they did this with laboratory animals. Most older adults don't spend most of their time in later life as couch potatoes without any stimulation. Increasingly, they're seeking stimulation. So when they compared two groups of laboratory animals, young animals, rats, and older ones, mice actually, they found that the older mice, they both showed at the start increased neurogenesis, with the younger mice having more than the older mice. But when they added stimulation, they found that the older mice had 50% more neurogenesis than the younger mice, the other half of the question. This is an extraordinary finding, and again, further sort of feeding into the stimulus and the impetus and the sense of possibility with brain fitness programs and maximizing not only physical health but mental functioning right to the end. It was really quite an amazing finding. Now, the ultimate expression of potential is creativity, and the definition that I use is a variation of one that Rollo May used a number of years ago. It's bringing something new into existence that's valued. And I feel that creativity is universal. And you say, well, how can it be universal? How can everybody be a great artist, writer, inventor? And here, Howard Gardner helps us out. Howard Gardner, in the field of education, talked about multiple intelligences. some people being verbal learners, others visual, others kinesthetic, etc. And he discussed the concept of creativity with a big C and creativity with a little c. And this brings the universality of the concept that there's so many examples of little c creativity where somebody brings something new into existence in everyday life, in their work, and dealing with problems at home. A new recipe. Somebody develops a fabulous new recipe. They've brought something new into existence that's valued. Everybody values the recipe. There are a few more chairs right up here. You won't block the camera or the slides. So the recipe, wonderful new recipe, wonderful product, new recipe. People want more of the recipe, more of the products. They brought something new into existence that's valued. And creativity isn't just in terms of the arts and literature and inventions, but also social creativity. This is an area where older adults have distinguished themselves over the history of civilization as keepers of the culture and transmitters of information still in so many key areas, leaders in fields and different fields, like the Supreme Court dominated by older persons, whether you agree with their opinions or not. But and history and psychology, in many areas where time, permitting an accumulation of perspective and information, has been a true asset to them. Social creativity. And voluntarism is a wonderful venue for a creative expression. This is sometimes for people the first time where a boss wasn't looking over their shoulder telling them to stay inside the envelope. The volunteer activities for many people provide an opportunity for creative expression. And since it's universal, you're not going to have a simple illustration or description of it. And I've described 4 categories, and I'm sure others can describe many other ways of describing creativity, but a continuing creativity with aging. This would be somebody like the great political cartoonist Herblock, who started doing his cartoons in his teens, and he continued them until just a week or two before he died in his 90s. Changing creativity with aging. Somebody like Bertrand Russell began as a mathematician, a very accomplished mathematician, and then transitioned to philosophy, changing creativity. Commencing creativity with aging. This is an area I'll come back to, dominated by folk artists, as one example, folk art being dominated by older artists as an example of commencing creativity, late onset creativity with aging, and the folk art story is also a terrific story of illustration of late blooming. I'll come back to that. And creativity in connection with loss. There's nothing romantic about illness, nothing at all, but it's part of the human condition. If somebody has the loss that prevents them from being able to do something the way they used to, it's not enough for most of us. We want to try to transcend that in certain ways. Henri Matisse, the great painter, illustrated this. In his early 80s, he had heart disease, lung disease, gastrointestinal disorder that sapped his energy. He became wheelchair-bound, could no longer paint the way that he used to, but that was not good enough for him. And so he turned to a whole new form of art that he could do in the wheelchair, his cutouts. There's a passion and the feeling that he felt. He experienced it as if he was cutting pure color, and just made an extraordinary contribution with this great work in many of the leading galleries around the world. Now, there's an area of creativity that many people in many different areas of science and gerontology have described as increasing with aging, and this is called pragmatic creativity. Some people call it practical intelligence. And I've studied this and have attempted to explain why pragmatic creativity increases with aging. Again, an example of a positive change that occurs not despite aging, but because of aging. And there are at least 2 major reasons why this happens. One social and the other psychological. The social one is sort of captured in the story of the great historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee, in his autobiography that he wrote in his late 70s, said that in retrospect, age had been a true asset to his work. As an historian, it allowed him the time to accumulate more facts than he ever realized he could accumulate, and the time to put it into perspective. So it was the role of social intelligence and contributing to pragmatic creativity. The other is a psychological explanation. Major part of my work for over 35 years has been on psychological growth and development. Erik Erikson had been really one of the few people who talked about psychological growth and development with aging. Remarkable in that he was a child and adolescent psychologist, and I had the great fortune of having him as one of my teachers in college right after he published his classic work on identity in the life cycle, where he described 8 stages of development across the life cycle. And it was a wonderful work. It was 50 pages, eloquent and elegant. But it wasn't until years later, when I became a gerontologist and reread his classic Identity in the Life Cycle, that I realized of those 50 pages, only 3 covered the time past adolescence, and only 1 covered the entire period of aging and half of middle life together. He's probably had the most successful sound bites in history, integrity versus despair. But this is not at all to diminish his work. He made an extraordinary contribution in showing that development continued with aging. And he was very humble. He wrote that what he had described was thin, and that he would leave it to his students. So I guess I took him literally. And I've been studying this area for over 35 years with literally thousands of clinical and research subjects. And it's led to a new formulation of 4 different phases. I describe them as phases, not stages. To me, stages, or to many people, stages imply something rigid, but that's not the nature of the human condition. It's fluid, and these phases often overlap one another by 10 or more years. The first of the 4 phases was midlife reevaluation. I'll come back to that. The second is key to the understanding of pragmatic creativity, and it's what I refer to as the liberation phase. Begins to phase in the 50s, particularly as we're moving to the mid-50s, and then it gets stronger as we move through our 50s into the 60s and the 70s, and what we experience stays with us. And it's as if during that time we're having these friendly inner metaphorical voices that are saying to us, if not now, when? Why not? What can they do to me? And those are very empowering feelings. There's a new sense of inner comfort, confidence, and courage to try something new. So let me give you a real-life illustration that illustrates pragmatic creativity. This is a true story. It's about my in-laws, and this took place over 10 years ago when they were in their early 70s, visiting my wife and me in Washington, D.C., where we live. And they wanted to spend the day at the National Gallery of Art. We said, great, we'll take you there, we'll pick you up. If that's Obama, I'll have to return his call. They wanted to spend the day at the National, was it? And so we said, great, we'll take you and we'll pick you up. They said, oh, no. We know the city, we take taxis everywhere, we know the subway system. We'll meet you here for dinner. Just give us your phone numbers. This is before everybody had cell phones. So they went to the gallery, and they had a fabulous day at the gallery. But when they came out, they were greeted by something totally unexpected and hadn't been forecast, and that was a flash snowstorm. Now, they hadn't seen this coming because in the gallery there were no windows to protect the paintings from the light. My wife and I had seen the snow coming, and we knew what happens in Washington when it snows, and so we were on our way home. And in Washington, with the appearance of a single snowflake, I've never quite understood this coming from Boston, but it has the opposite effect of spontaneous generation, the spontaneous disappearance of taxis immediately with the appearance of the first flake. And the few that are still there, it's impossible to flag one down because they're filled with people, so they couldn't get a taxi. And my wife and I had left work, and so they couldn't reach us, and we were in the immediate snag that happens on the roadways, second now only to L.A., in traffic in Washington. And so we weren't at work, we weren't at home. But they weren't concerned. They knew the subway system. And so they figured they'd take the subway, which would bring them closer to us, not close enough, but they hoped when they got off at the new stop that then they'd be able to reach us, or maybe there they could get a taxi. They got out of the subway. They still couldn't reach us, still no taxis. But then my father-in-law, in the liberation phase, looked across the street and saw something that brought a smile and a twinkle to his eyes as those dendrites were firing. He saw the steamy windows of a Domino's pizza parlor. He carefully took my mother-in-law's arm, crossed the slushy road, entered the pizza parlor, walked up to the counter, and ordered a large cheese pizza for home delivery. Then he said, there's one more thing. What's that, they asked. He said, I would like you to deliver us with it. And they did. We had just arrived home ourselves, and the pizza van comes up. Out comes the pizza guy, then my mother-in-law, then my father-in-law, wearing a large grin, carrying a large cheese pizza. Now, he had never done the pizza parlor caper before, but he was in the liberation phase. Why not? What's the worst that can happen? Long life, learned he could go outside the box, back inside, and it was very empowering. Now, I don't know about you, but I am so sick and tired of people describing word finding as the defining moment of your later years, the senior moment. And so I've introduced a new concept called the new senior moment. And these experiences that what I've described with my father-in-law, looking across the street, coming up with a creative solution on the spot, this is really a reflection of the new senior moment. But it's a positive change because of aging, not despite aging, and it's because of the impact of accruing social knowledge and intelligence and psychological growth in the form of the liberation phase. Now, I mentioned little c creativity. Sometimes that little c creativity takes a leap to big C creativity. This has happened with Maria Ann Smith in 19th century Australia. She's in her late 60s. Late 60s in 19th century Australia looks a little bit different than late 60s today. Very unusual to be in the late 60s in 19th century Australia. But Maria Ann Smith, I mentioned recipes. She enjoyed working with novel recipes, and particularly using fruit seeds. And in her late 60s was working with a new apple seed recipe, which became the Granny Smith apple. It took that leap from little c to big C creativity. This is another illustration of this. One of my heroes, William Edmondson. Up until his mid-60s, he was the janitor in, at that time, the Women's Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. The 1930s was, of course, the Great Depression. We're wondering if we're entering another one. And many institutions folded, including hospitals where he had been working. And so he lost his job. Being a janitor is what he did. But as he later described to a reporter, he had the inspiration to carve. And he began to do extraordinary sculptures. A couple of years later, a photographer who heard about Edmondson and his work visited him in his studio, was totally captivated by his sculptures and by Edmondson himself, and put together a portfolio of images of Edmondson's work and sent them to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And in 1937, at the age of 67, Edmondson's work became the basis of the first solo exhibit by a black artist in the history of the MoMA. Now, after this show, I did more in-depth study on folk art, and after this exhibit, and actually it was prompted by an exhibit I had just witnessed where I discovered Edmondson's work that the Corcoran Museum of Art had put together in 1980, and this is where my work on creativity in aging entered its formal phase. The Corcoran put together a 50-year retrospective of folk art in America, 1930 to 1980. And they had 20 of the best artists during that period represented their work, as many of them were deceased. And I went to the show not only with the eyes of somebody who appreciates art, but the eyes of a gerontologist, somebody who studies aging. And I saw something that neither the art historian nor the curator of the show had described, certainly in no way emphasized, and that was, of the 20 artists, 16 of them only did their first work or reached their mature or best phase after the age of 65. That was 80%. This is a 50-year retrospective. Edmondson was one of those artists. And 30% in the show did their first work or reached the mature phase after the age of 80. I mean, Grandma Moses was just one of a huge crowd. And the artist whose work was on the cover of the catalog, Bill Trailer, did his first work at 85. And then I did much more in-depth research on folk artists after the show and found, regardless of the racial, ethnic, socioeconomic background of these folk artists, they were dominated by older artists. Now, prior to that, when I would give a talk and I'd mention Picasso, Matisse, George O'Keeffe, artists who continued to do extraordinary work into their 80s or 90s, the audience would get restless and they'd start to say, "What is this, Dr. Cohen? These are outliers. They're exceptions rather than the rule. Is this a Ripley's Believe It or Not presentation?" Well, those are fair questions. But seeing this folk art exhibit turned all that around. Here was an entire field dominated by older persons. They were the rule. They weren't the exception. Any field that's dominated by older adults makes a tremendous statement about the inherent creative potential with aging. The naysayers, of course, come into play again. They say, well, he was a folk artist. Raise the question, what's the difference between a folk artist and a fine art artist? They both are typically trained or have long periods of time influencing their training. The fine art artist formally, the folk artist through the community, the culture they live in, often their family, passing down of these skills. The difference between a folk artist and a fine art artist makes no statement about their passion for what they're doing. Their content is different. The fine artist is formally trained in the history of art, and the folk artist is, again, influenced by local culture and traditions. What about impact? Who could have a bigger impact than Edinson, opening the doors for generations that followed? As a matter of fact, after the show, he was no longer referred to as a folk artist, but he was a folk artist. And a number of folk artists have this history and experience. So again, very powerful statement about creative potential and a wonderful illustration for all of us about it never being too late in the story of late blooming. Irving Dominic, this was another famous folk art exhibit in Washington at the National Museum of American Art, retired at 65 and turned to sculpture. And his work was on the cover of the catalog of this show. It was called Made with Passion, and his sculpture was called Marla. Now, if you look, he did this at 67. If you look very carefully at Marla, you see that she looks very tin-like, very metallic, very cylindrical. The head, the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the torso, the legs. Up until he retired at the age of 65, Irving Dominic had worked in a heating and air conditioning company making ductwork. He didn't totally reinvent himself. He was in the liberation phase. If not now, when? Why not? What's the worst that can happen? And he soared. He made that adjustment, turning to the skills that he had. I'm not going to go into these because of time limitations or the depth, but these are the four phases that I've described. The liberation phase, reevaluations. The first, summing up, encore. I'm going to give just a few examples that will illustrate these other areas. And this is a lead-in to midlife reevaluation, where for the longest time people felt that the big issue at midlife was midlife crisis, but a number of studies since those early views have really shown that midlife crisis is, in a clinical sense, no greater than crisis at any other part of the life cycle. But from my research, what I've identified as the real issue is midlife reevaluation. And not only from my research, but two other major streams of research that feed into this. One, a field in psychology that began in sort of the latter third of the 20th century, followers of Piaget. Piaget, like Freud, felt development was only a first quarter of the life cycle phenomenon. Piaget looked at intellectual development, Freud's psychological development. Piaget described four phases of intellectual development, the fourth and final being formal operations, which occurred in one's teen years and early adult years, which he felt was the pinnacle of intellectual thought. Didn't reconcile the fact that while teenagers do many brilliant things, they do a number of things that are very questionable in terms of their wisdom and judgment. And part of that is from still far to be fully developed frontal lobe. Well, one of the great things about having students is they don't necessarily accept everything you say and enjoy challenging your work. And Piaget's students continued his work and described a fifth area of intellectual development, which began to emerge in midlife and matured further as we age. And he referred to this as postformal thought. Unlike formal thought that was very analytic, postformal was synthetic. Unlike formal, which was very objective, postformal was synthetic. Unlike formal thought, which looked for the right answer, postformal thought recognized that in many critical issues there are competing, contradictory solutions, sort of a forest versus the trees perspective. And as I was thinking about this and writing my book, The Mature Mind, doing the initial background work in 2002, I was thinking it was almost as if they were building upon or describing an aspect of Sperry's work. Roger Sperry, who got a Nobel Prize for talking about right-left brain differences, right brain in a more concrete sense being more verbal, left brain being more visual. It seemed like these scientists in the area of postformal thought were talking about almost a better integration of the brain. And I was wondering, I wonder what's happening in the biological arena. Is there some kind of counterpart? And after a period of searching the literature, 2 weeks later, a new study appeared. One of the great things in science is you're starting to think about something in a different way. You're rarely alone. There are a lot of others that are influenced by the same body of knowledge, same cultural climate. And this new study was at Duke by Roberto Cabiza, looking at how we use the two hemispheres of our brain as we age. And he compared young adults with middle-aged adults. And he had them do the same tasks while their brains were being studied under brain imaging, functional MRI imaging, where as they conducted a task, you could see where and how long the brain lit up. And what he found, starting with the young adults, is that they indeed use both sides of their brain, but depending on the task, they use one side more than the other. Some tasks more left brain, other tasks more right brain. But then when he looked at those in their middle years, he discovered this remarkable finding of people increasingly using both sides of their brain together. He used this cumbersome acronym called the Herald Model: Hemisphere Asymmetry Reduction in Older Adults, the greater use of one side and the other, depending on the task, beginning to diminish with the more synchronized use. In shorthand, I refer to it as moving to all-wheel drive. And the remarkable thing is that this was happening simultaneously with a description of what was occurring in postformal thought. And so I suggested that these two are connected phenomena, that we're biopsychosocial creatures, and here we're seeing a biological concomitant to the psychosocial changes that those in the postformal area were describing. Now let me show you how powerful these changes are, these positive changes because of aging, not despite aging, with postformal thought and moving to all-wheel drive, again happening at the same time. So basically, what this is allowing us to do is look at the same information that we looked at in a different way. We're mobilizing new parts of the brain, getting the added value of other parts of the brain and looking at this new information. And so it may have been a problem that we kept doing over and over again, getting it wrong. And then suddenly, as we're moving into midlife, we have a new perspective on it. And I suggest that new perspective is related to these positive changes that occur because of aging, not despite aging. So let me illustrate with this scientist in 19th century England, who from the age of 22 to 27 traveled around the world, studied thousands of species, filled dozens upon dozens of notebooks with his information, completed that data acquisition at the age of 27, felt he had something very significant, but he couldn't put it all together. And then he was 27, but then over the next 23 years, that same information, I suggest through the impact of PostFormal Thought, moving to all-wheel drive in the brain, he started to make connections that he wasn't able to make before. And his greatest obstacle, hurdle, he finally resolved when he was 45. And he realized he truly had something revolutionary. He thought, though, it was going to be not only revolutionary to science, but to religion. And so he was chicken to publish it. So a few more years go by. He's approaching 50. He's starting to move towards the liberation phase. If not now, when? Why not? What's the worst that can happen? And so he publishes his work, and you may have heard of it. It was called On the Origin of Species, the story of Charles Darwin. And I feel with these changes that are going on in the brain at that time, initially they were disparaged, not the accuracy of the findings of moving to all-wheel drive, but the significance. People said, well, this is the response of a desperate brain losing capacity. But then as the experiments were changed and people who were well-functioning and they were studied, people started to see an asset as well as a compensatory role of these changes. And I was the first to suggest that when this is happening, you're not only getting recruiting tissue for the task at hand, but you're getting some of the added value of that tissue in its own terms. It's like an off-label effect of a drug. When aspirin first came out, people marveled at the effect on lowering fever and pain, but then found all these other reasons. And I feel that with moving to all-wheel drive, you're getting some of the added value of parts of the brain that had not been used as much in these different tasks. And it broadens our repertoire of perspective and what we can do. And I feel that any activity that optimally uses both sides of the brain is savored by the brain, and it results in our wanting to do the activity. And I feel that art is one of those activities. It's like chocolate to the brain. And although you see it across the life cycle, I feel that it also influences the desire on the part of many people to only come to art in the second half of life, like the folk artists and the music. This exploding phenomenon was what's called New Horizons bands. These are happening all over the country. Groups in their past 50 and 65 going back to instruments that they were introduced to in primary and elementary school, or starting brand new with instruments. This rising interest in many forms of art. Another positive change because of aging, not despite aging, is in the part of the brain that initially processes emotions, the amygdala. It's right next to the hippocampus, which processes memories and was where neurogenesis was discovered. In another study using functional MRI, looking at how young adults and older adults process emotions, the way this was done is the young adults and older adults were exposed to positive and negative emotions, while looking at how their brains responded under brain imaging, functional MRI. Positive emotions, love, joy, happiness; negative emotions, fear, anger, envy. And with the young adults, well, both the young adults and older adults, in response to positive emotions, their brain, the amygdala lit up in the same way, just as intensely, just as long. But with negative emotions, the older adults, the amygdala lit up less intensely and dissipated faster. And this, I think, contributes to our understanding of a number of phenomena. Like we all have the general sense that with aging, our fuse lengthens. Something annoys us, we're much more likely to have a little more time go by before we shoot off at our mouth in terms of something that bothers us. 25-year-old, something annoys them, the boss says something, and they might, with a less mature amygdala and emotional state, say, "You're an idiot." Well, there are consequences of calling your boss an idiot. A 50-year-old may have the same feeling, but pause a little bit longer. The fuse is longer. And also, social phobias diminish with aging. We all know people who, if in their 20s, asked to get up to say something, not me, I can't in front of a crowd. 45 years later, you may see them, maybe not as a lead singer, but part of a community a chorus, a chorale. More comfort in that regard. I'm coming to the end here. This is not Georgia O'Keeffe, but this is a person under one of her paintings to show the size of her painting. In different biographies about O'Keeffe, different fears were described, and one of them was a fear of flying. I don't know if it was a phobia, but it was significant. But as she became increasingly renowned artist, she painted into her 90s. And by her 70s, getting requests all around the world for exhibits and presentations. She was on a flight one day, and she looked out the window, and she suddenly realized she no longer had a fear of flying. And she felt this tremendous exhilaration. Now, it probably had social psychological components in terms of the amount of flying going by, but also these changes in the amygdala alter the way that you deal with fears. And she used that exhilaration and translated that into a whole new body of work. It was the largest number of paintings she ever did in a single show, almost 100. And you can see here the size of the paintings. This is 8 by 35 feet in size. They were the biggest that she ever did. And I'll give her full credit that she totally understood the double meaning, the double entendre of the title of her work, Sky Above Clouds. And she gives us a new metaphor about aging. This is another example. I don't know about you, but I am so tired of the metaphors that we hear about aging. They're patronizing, and they've persisted because they're poetic. You're in the autumn of your life. The leaves are falling off your tree. The ground is barren. It's ice. It's cold. Well, here she gives us a new metaphor, very realistic. Yes, there can be clouds, but blue sky above the clouds. Shortly after one of my presentations on this, I didn't realize there was a film producer in the audience, Melissa Godoy, who recently published this film, Do Not Go Gently. It's a wonderful film on creativity in later life after the age of 80. Walter Cronkite is the narrator. I'm the scientific commentator. Anyway, she was on her way to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for a fun day. And at the end of the show, she went into the art store, and she saw something. She said, "Oh, I know who will like this." And so she got it for me, and she sent it to me. And I carry this with me, rain or shine. It's my Georgia O'Keeffe umbrella. Blue sky above clouds. So this is, and this also contributes to the third of the four phases that I described, the summing up phase, where part of it is looking back and sharing our life story through autobiography, but it's also looking at unfinished business and what allows us to deal with unfinished business and deal with fears, such as in this case with Georgia O'Keeffe, and also in this famous story from literature. Famous figure from London in 1843, described as mean-spirited, miserable, misanthropic, making the lives of all around him miserable. He was described as a caricature of aging, becoming more like himself. But increasingly now, as we understand the liberation phase, people branching out, if you're becoming more constricted, it's probably not aging, which is what we learned in the 70s, the difference between aging and age-associated problems, depression. He had a chronic, undiagnosed depression. But he, in his 70s, in 1843, 19th century England, was the fortunate beneficiary of a home visit by a multidisciplinary team of 3 over 100 years before the community outreach program of the 20th century. They employed psychodynamic dream work, 50 years before Freud's classic work on the interpretation of dreams, some of the initial art therapy, life review that went on, and turned it all around for him. This, of course, is the famous case history of Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, let me tell you the real reason that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. This is a true story, only the facts have been changed. Dickens wanted to show how often depression was confused with aging. Wouldn't you two be depressed? He wanted to show that with aging, even with chronic illnesses, in this case chronic mental health problems, there's always a window of opportunity to make a difference. He wanted to show the value of psychotherapy, art therapy, dream work, life review, and he wanted to show that when you help older people, it need not be at the expense of other age groups. Witness the benefit of this intervention to the community of London, Bob Cratchit, and Tiny Tim. God bless us all. This is the real reason that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. He particularly wanted to show that with aging, it was never too late to change, never too late to get out of a rut. You heard it here at the Andrews Gerontology Center. With aging, and just a couple more slides and we're done, this is another concept I've introduced, that these individual phenomena of the mind all individually mature, but then begin to also work better together with aging. It's not just the individual maturing, but the synchrony of these: cognition, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, like with the amygdala, cognition, postformal thought, social intelligence, pragmatic creativity, judgment, life experience, consciousness, spirituality. And this underlying mechanism shows itself as wisdom. The fourth stage, the encore stage, described encore in the French sense, still continuing. I feel that what we see here is this phenomenon where aging may be the best illustration of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Good with Burns. If you looked at the parts and he's describing all the changes, you do the subtraction, what effect is it? But he says, sitting down, lying down, I'm just as good. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Aesop told us this. Aesop's tales were oral tales, and I found what I believe is the first written description of the tortoise and the hare, and it was the old tortoise and the young hare. And then in sort of contemporary life, Yoda, he's the only person outside the Bible who reached 900. But he really is an illustration of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And the final slide there with his Jedi colleague. Again, the point is there's no denying the problems with aging, but what has been denied is the potential. And dealing with the two of them represents the new state of the art in the field of aging today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are having some food and drink in the courtyard out here. The fountain that you see is the Fountain of Aging, formerly known as the Fountain of Youth. And thank you for coming. Thank you, Jean.
There's also some quotes from some senior citizens that put together.
Oh, and we have some quilts that are, where are they?
On display. They're just outside of the reception.
On display that some people from the Senior Citizen Center nearby have done.
I looked at my daughter show. She has one of those.